The world we're living in right now, well, it's just one version of reality. But just a few short years ago, we were literally a single misstep away from a much, much darker one. So today, we're going to explore the timeline that almost was. A full-scale war between the two most populous nations on Earth, India and China.
I want you to just forget the world you remember from that year. Picture something totally different, something way darker. A reality that was just hanging by a thread, where one single miscalculation didn't just make the news, it completely redrew the map of the 21st century.
So, in this other timeline, that brutal hand-to-hand clash in the remote Galwan Valley, it doesn't end with a tense standoff. No. Instead, a shot is fired, and then another one. The fragile agreement not to use guns is shattered. Casualties start mounting into the hundreds. Back in Delhi and Beijing, the diplomatic hotlines just go dead. The nationalist fervor, stoked by these shocking images from the front, it just becomes unstoppable. Both sides order full-scale military mobilization, and just like that, the war begins.
And look, this isn't some distant regional conflict. We're talking about the world's two biggest manufacturing and service hubs going to war. Global supply chains don't just bend, they completely snap. Markets in New York, London, Tokyo, they plummet. A refugee crisis on a scale you can't even imagine starts to unfold. And hanging over all of it is this terrifying reality. Two nuclear-armed nations, home to nearly 3 billion people, are in a fight to the death.
This whole scenario, it feels like something out of a movie, I know. But it is built from the very real tensions and trends of our world. It was a frighteningly plausible path, which, of course, leads to the big question. Why are we living in our timeline and not that one? What pulled us back from the absolute brink?
Well, the answer really lies in a single, pivotal moment in recent history. A breaking point that, thankfully, didn't fully break. We're talking about the real-world clash that happened in the Galwan Valley.
So on June 15, 2020, a brutal skirmish really did happen. It was violent, it was deadly, and it resulted in the first combat deaths on that border in 45 years. Just think about that for a second. Nearly half a century of a tense but non-lethal standoff was just shattered. The potential for this thing to spiral out of control was immense. But instead of mobilizing for war, something else happened. Military commanders actually met for de-escalation talks. Diplomatic channels, even though they were strained, were activated. And a very, very fragile peace was maintained.
And this right here really shows you the razor's edge we were on. Just look at this. In our timeline, commanders chose restraint. In the other, a miscalculation leads to gunfire. In our world, political leaders talked. In the other, they mobilized. Every single one of these decision points could have easily gone the other way. The mechanisms for crisis management held, but man, just barely.
That near miss forces us to ask a much deeper question. It's not just about what happened in that one moment in 2020. It's about why that moment was so combustible to begin with. What created a situation where a simple border skirmish could threaten to ignite a world war? Huge conflicts like this almost never appear out of thin air. They're what happens when long-term pressures build up over time. The tension in 2020 was the result of 3 decades of kindling being carefully and sometimes completely unintentionally laid, just waiting for a single spark. So to understand the fire, we've got to trace the political friction that generated all this heat. We need to follow the journey from this once optimistic idea of Hindi Chini bye-bye, which means India and China are brothers, to the reality we have today of deep strategic suspicion.
So this whole shift really started back around 1990. The end of the Cold War completely changed the game in Asia. At the same time, you had a more assertive Hindu nationalism rising in India, while China was really accelerating its own assertiveness on the world stage. Positions on the border and on Tibet started to harden, and that old sense of, a shared destiny was just replaced by pure rivalry.
But it wasn't just politics. There were these powerful economic and social engines also pushing these two giants towards a collision course. These forces were reshaping their societies from the inside out, and that, in turn, was reshaping their relationship with each other. Now, what's really fascinating here is how economic connection, which we usually assume brings peace, right? It can actually create a ton of friction. When that economic relationship is massively imbalanced, it doesn't build bridges, it can actually breed resentment and competition.
Okay, this table here just lays it all out perfectly. China's explosive, just mind-blowing growth created a huge power imbalance. India found itself with this massive trade deficit, which basically means it was buying way more from China than it was selling. That kind of one-sided relationship, it just fuels resentment back home.
And as both nations grew, they started chasing the same finite resources around the globe, turning what could have been simple economic competition into a really high-stakes strategic game.
And then you throw this into the mix, a powerful new force, popular nationalism, completely supercharged by technology. All of a sudden, foreign policy wasn't just for diplomats in quiet rooms anymore. Nope. It was being debated and shouted and memed by hundreds of millions of people online.
Social media became an absolute tinderbox. Every little border dispute, every perceived insult could now generate a firestorm of digital outrage. Old historical grievances were dug up and weaponized for clicks and shares. This put immense pressure on leaders in both countries, making it politically almost impossible to back down or compromise. You see, appearing tough on the enemy became a political necessity.
And if all that wasn't enough, the strategic landscape itself was being transformed by two very modern forces: technology and the environment. And these weren't just background issues, they were becoming active battlegrounds, creating brand new and really dangerous points of friction.
Okay, this slide shows you something that is, honestly, an existential threat. China controls the Tibetan Plateau, which is the source of Asia's great rivers. So by building all these massive dams on rivers that flow into India, Beijing essentially gets a hand on India's water tap. This is not just an environmental issue, it is a strategic weapon that threatens India's agriculture and its security, making it a very real potential trigger for a future conflict.
So when you put it all together, the political rivalry, the economic friction, the popular nationalism, and these new strategic threats like water, you see a pretty clear picture. The timeline of peace we are living in, it was not guaranteed. Not at all. It was just one of two equally probable outcomes.
And this, right here, is the most crucial point to take away. That war scenario we started with isn't some wild fantasy. It is a parallel path built from the very same real-world forces that exist right now. It doesn't require any alien invasions or impossible events. All it needs is for one critical moment for those mechanisms of restraint to fail.
And let's never, ever forget the stakes. This isn't some abstract geopolitical game. A conflict between these two nations directly puts the lives and the futures of nearly 3 billion people. That's almost 40% of humanity on the line. The scale is it's almost impossible to truly comprehend. You know, there's this quote that just absolutely nails it. It's a critical reminder that we often take peace for granted, as if it's the default setting of the world. But it's not. It is a fragile achievement. It's the result of constant effort, constant dialogue, and constant restraint, all of which can break down under pressure.
And that leaves us with a pretty unsettling final thought. The kindling that nearly caught fire back in 2020, well, it's all still there. The border is still disputed, the nationalism is still fervent, and the strategic competition is only getting more intense. The restraints held once. The question we all have to ask ourselves is, will they hold again?
All right, welcome to part 2. This time, we're going right to the front lines, high up in the Himalayas. We're going to break down what actually happened back in June 2020, this absolutely brutal, almost medieval clash that pushed two nuclear-armed neighbors right to the edge of war. And we'll look at the incredibly fragile peace that somehow barely managed to hold. It all starts with a fact that just doesn't make sense. On this one freezing night in the Himalayas, a battle breaks out between two of the world's biggest armies. By morning, dozens are dead. But the thing that made this one of the most dangerous moments of the 21st century, not a single bullet was fired. So, where did this all go down? A place called the Galwan Valley. I mean, this is one of the most remote, punishing landscapes on the entire planet. And for years, it's been a major flashpoint in the long-running border dispute between India and China. Now, to really get what happened here, you have to understand one crucial rule. It's all about something called the Line of Actual Control, or LAC. See, it's not a real internationally recognized border. It's a tense, contested line in the mountains. And back in '96, to keep things from escalating, both sides agreed to a critical rule: no guns. And not one rule was about to be tested in the most horrifying way possible. Because when an Indian colonel, Santosh Babu, led his men to confront Chinese troops, that ban on firearms led to, well, this. Just look at the weapons they used. Stones, iron rods, clubs literally wrapped in barbed wire. This was not modern warfare. This was a medieval brawl fought at 14,000 feet with unbelievable savagery in the thin, freezing air. When the sun came up, the true cost became terrifyingly clear. 24 soldiers were dead, 20 from the Indian side and an estimated 4 from the Chinese side. It was, by far, the deadliest fight between these two nuclear powers in more than 40 years. And the whole world just held its breath, wondering what would happen next.
That one night, that single, brutal clash was the spark that lit the fuse. The reaction that followed on both sides was instant, it was powerful, and, as you're about to see, completely different.
And this slide just nails that contrast. In India, it was a public explosion of fury. You had protests erupting, people out in the streets smashing Chinese-made TVs, and a massive public outcry for military revenge. It was everywhere. But in China, the response was totally controlled by the state. The whole incident was downplayed, they admitted their casualties way later, and all the official messaging was just about projecting national strength and calm.
So you've got this boiling pot of nationalistic anger on one side and this very calculated, controlled message on the other. The big question is, how on earth did this not spiral into an all-out war? Well, according to the experts, there were 4 huge factors that pulled them back from the edge. First, just a cold, hard calculation. Both leaders knew a real war would be an absolute catastrophe, especially for India, which faced some serious military disadvantages up in the Himalayas. Second, that strange but vital no-guns agreement. As brutal as the fight was, it prevented the kind of lightning-fast escalation that happens the second shots are fired. Third, you have to remember the global picture. The whole world was deep in the chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic. Nobody wanted a major war right then. And finally, some old, dusty back channels were suddenly switched back on. Dormant diplomatic lines were opened up, giving both sides a way to talk and de-escalate. But here's the key takeaway. Avoiding war did not mean things went back to normal. Not even close. The Galwan clash completely changed the game, maybe forever, for the relationship between these two Asian giants. And this timeline really shows you how deep that wound was. I mean, look at this. It took more than 4 years just to get to the first real disengagement agreement. Direct flights didn't even start coming back until 2025. This was not a quick patch-up job. It was a slow, grinding process, filled with distrust. I think one analyst just summed it up perfectly. They said the relationship went from managed competition to managed hostility. The goal wasn't about partnership anymore. It was now just about managing this new cold reality. And the fallout from this is still being felt today. There's been a huge military buildup on both sides of the border that hasn't stopped. The trust between the two countries? Completely shattered. India started moving much faster towards strategic partnerships like the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia. And for the leaders of both countries, the idea of compromise became politically poisonous. But now, get ready for the really weird part. Amidst all this hostility, look at this number. Their economies actually got more entangled. India's trade deficit with China ballooned to nearly $100 billion. See, if these two major strategic rivals, who at the same time can't seem to afford to unplug from each other, it's a huge paradox. So we know a war was avoided. That's the crucial fact. But how close did we really come? Just how thin was that line between the worlds we live in now and a much, much darker one? And that's the question that keeps defense analysts up at night. Because when you really look at the details, you start to see all the different ways this could have gone horribly wrong. Let's just start with the most obvious one. What if that 1996 agreement didn't hold? What if, in the middle of all that chaos, just one soldier on either side had panicked and opened fire? Or what if that massive wave of public anger in India had simply become too much for the government to ignore? What if it had forced their hand, making them order a military strike in retaliation? That was a very, very real possibility. When you boil it all down, it comes to this one simple truth. The difference between peace and war wasn't that there weren't enough reasons to fight. Believe me, there were plenty. The difference was that there were just enough restraints still in place. And those restraints were stretched almost to the breaking point. Which brings us to this final, chilling thought. Just picture that moment again, in the absolute freezing darkness of the Himalayas. What if that was the moment? What if the world had stumbled across a line that it could never go back from? What would our world actually look like today if those restraints had snapped? That is the question we're going to answer in part 3, when we step into the alternate history of the war that became so incredibly close to being real.
We are going to explore the war that wasn't, a massive conflict that could have totally reshaped our world, but was somehow narrowly avoided. And to really get how close we came, let's start by imagining a different, much darker reality.
So, welcome to part 3. I want you to, just for a moment, step out of our reality and into another one.
The global economy is in a complete freefall. I mean, a kind we haven't seen in generations. That whole intricate web of trade that basically defined our modern world, it's been torn to shreds, and you can feel the consequences in every single home.
The very things that make modern life run, they just feel totally unstable. And you have to ask, why? What happened?
Well, it's because the two giants of Asia, India and China, are at war. Now, this is the world that could have been. So to really understand how our timeline managed to avoid this absolute catastrophe, we have to go back to a really crucial turning point in history.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock to the end of the Cold War. As that old world order was crumbling, a huge power vacuum opened up. And right at that moment, both India and China were going through these massive internal changes that would pretty much set the stage for the next 30 years.
And just look at how both of these nations were remaking themselves at the exact same time. You've got 1989, China cements its model of market authoritarianism right after Tiananmen Square. Then just 2 years later, 1991, India has a massive economic crisis and it's forced to ditch socialism and open up its economy. Then you see the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, really marked by the demolition of the Babri Masjid in '92. And then the big one, India's 1998 nuclear tests, with the government explicitly and publicly naming China as a threat. You have two giants on brand new paths suddenly looking at each other in a very, very different way.
But see, these new paths were laid right on top of some very old, very deep cracks in the relationship. These are the 3 core issues that just never went away. The Tibetan wound, a source of deep suspicion going all the way back to 1959. The disputed border, this colonial-era line that Beijing has just never accepted. And of course, the all-weather friendship between China and Pakistan, which creates India's ultimate strategic nightmare, a potential 2-front war. I mean, these are all the ingredients for a massive conflict.
So with all that combustible material just lying around, how on earth did our world avoid the fire? Well, this is where we're going to explore that fork in the road, that critical moment where our timeline split away from that disastrous alternate future. It all really boils down to this one question. After those 1998 nuclear tests, tensions were sky high. The new government in India had a pretty hawkish stance. What if, instead of pursuing dialogue, they had just decided to push back, and push back hard?
And right here, we see the first major split. So in our timeline, after '98, both sides kept talking. They continued dialogue, but in that alternate timeline, India kicks off an aggressive forward policy in the year 2000, building roads, building posts deep in disputed territory. Of course, China responds in kind, and that creates this vicious cycle of escalation, where neither side feels like it can afford to back down.
Okay, let's jump forward to 2017 and see how this plays out. In our world, the Doklam standoff was this incredibly tense 73-day military face-off. But crucially, it was resolved without a single shot being fired. In the alternate timeline, though, a timeline poisoned by almost 2 decades of this escalatory cycle, it becomes a shooting incident. A Chinese patrol opens fire, killing 3 Indian soldiers. And just like that, the taboo is broken. And that leads us to the final breaking point in 2020. You probably remember this horrific images from the real Galwan clash. It was like a medieval battle with clubs and stones. But in the alternate timeline, this isn't some patrol skirmish. No, it's mechanized warfare. After years of fortifying their positions, both sides have dug in troops, heavy weapons, pre-planned responses. An exchange of gunfire escalates, and it escalates fast, into a full-blown battle, finally triggering the war that shatters their world.
So that is the nightmare scenario. Now let's come back to our reality and take a look at the circuit breakers, the specific choices and agreements that actually prevented that chain reaction of escalation from happening.
This agreement from 1996 on what are called confidence-building measures, or CBMs, was an absolutely crucial turning point. And the core principle of this treaty was incredibly simple, but so powerful. No firearms would be used at the line of actual control. You could argue that this single rule is the main reason why the 2020 Galwan clash, as awful as it was, stayed a hand-to-hand fight and didn't explode into a shooting war.
Look, this peace was not an accident. It was built piece by piece over decades. It started with diplomatic openings, like Rajiv Gandhi's visit way back in 1988. It was solidified by binding agreements like the one we just saw. It was reinforced by strategic cooperation in forums like BRICS, which gave both sides very real reasons to keep things stable. And, ultimately, it all depended on restrained leadership, on leaders from both countries making the conscious choice, again and again, to pull back from the brink.
There's a quote from one of the sources that I think just nails it. History is not destiny, but history creates conditions, constraints, and possibilities. All the conditions for war, they were there, but the choices made by leaders created the possibility for peace. Destiny wasn't written in stone, it was actively negotiated.
Okay, let's go back for a moment to that other war-torn world we imagined at the start. It avoided our history, sure, but at what cost?
The consequences of a conflict like that would just ripple across the entire globe, forcing all of humanity to confront a new and, frankly, terrifying reality.
I mean, think about it. So much of what we use every single day is built or assembled by the combined workforce of these two nations. In a world where they are at war, where does all that capacity go? Who picks up the slack?
And it's not just industry. Both India and China are agricultural powerhouses. They feed billions of people. What happens to global food security when their fields literally become battlegrounds? And this is really the ultimate question. The human cost is just staggering. When almost a third of humanity is mobilized for war, what happens to progress, to innovation, to the very future of our species?
That broken world is exactly where we're headed next. We're going to examine the full devastating impact of this war that wasn't, and what it tells us about the fragility of our own peace in the final part of this series.
Part 4. Today, we're exploring a history that thankfully didn't happen. A history where two giants, representing nearly 40% of all humanity, and with a combined economy of over $17 trillion, were pushed right to the edge of war. And the push didn't come from ideology, but from the powerful, almost invisible forces of economics and demographics.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is a story that doesn't really unfold on a battlefield. It happens in boardrooms, on stock exchanges, and deep within the census data that maps out a nation's entire future. It's a story about a rivalry that grew so big, so vast, it really threatened to pull the whole world down with it.
To really get a handle on the pressure that was building, you have to start right here, with the sheer scale of this economic shift. I mean, look at the year 2000. China's economy was bigger than India's, sure, but they were kind of in the same ballpark. Flash forward 20 years, the gap didn't just widen, it became a massive chasm. China's economy exploded to more than 5 times the size of India's. That's not just a gap, that's a whole new power dynamic.
And this, right here, shows you what happens with all that new wealth. It directly translates into military might. China started pouring its immense economic power into modernizing its army at a speed India just couldn't hope to match. This wasn't just about new tanks and jets. It changed the entire calculus of a potential conflict, leaving India in a tougher and tougher strategic corner.
Now you'd think, wouldn't you, that countries that trade a lot with each other would never ever go to war. It seems logical, right? I mean, there's just too much to lose. But the reality between India and China, well, it was a lot more complex and frankly, a lot more dangerous than that.
The economic connection between them just grew exponentially. Just look at that number. It went from under $3 billion to over $87 billion in just 2 decades. For a long, long time, everyone saw this as the ultimate safety net. War, unthinkable. The financial cost would be astronomical. But that optimism was hiding a really critical vulnerability.
And here's where the perspective shifts. This quote from an Indian diplomat way back in 2005 really nails it. The fear wasn't just about a rivalry anymore. It was about dependency. What do you do when your biggest economic partner is also your biggest strategic threat? It puts you in a very, very tricky spot.
So here's the crucial point. This was not a partnership of equals, not even close. You had India exporting raw materials and, in return, importing finished, higher value goods from China. This setup created a huge, ongoing trade deficit for India, but more importantly, it created an asymmetric dependency, a structural weakness that China could, potentially, use as leverage in any kind of dispute. All right, let's shift gears from money to people, because this is where it gets even more complicated. It turns out both countries were facing their own ticking demographic clocks, and these clocks were pushing them in very different but equally dangerous directions. What's so fascinating about this is how these completely opposite trends could lead to a similar, dangerous outcome. In China, the leadership saw a window closing. There was this feeling that if they were ever going to act on their big ambitions, It had to be soon, before their population aged and their workforce shrank. At the same time, India's government was under this incredible pressure to create jobs for millions and millions of young people, a situation that can make fiery nationalism sound incredibly appealing.
So, you take all that economic pressure and all that demographic tension, and you pour it right on top of the most ancient driver of human conflict there is, the competition for essential resources.
This is just a stark, undeniable geographic reality. China is upstream. The major rivers that are the absolute lifeblood for hundreds of millions of people in India, they all start in territory that China controls. This simple fact gave Beijing incredible leverage over India's water supply. And this was made even worse by China's massive dam building projects and the fact that there was no formal water sharing treaty between them at all.
And the rivalry spread across every critical resource you can think of. Both nations were desperate to secure energy, which led to intense competition over key sea lanes. China's string of pearls naval strategy felt like a strategic encirclement to India. And in the high-tech world, China's near monopoly on rare earth minerals meant it held a powerful economic weapon, which only deepened that sense of dependency India felt.
So you've got all these pressures building up: economic imbalance, ticking demographic clocks, fierce resource competition. It's like a powder keg waiting for a spark. So in our alternative timeline, what was the trigger? Well, just imagine a world where the 2020 economic crisis wasn't just bad, but absolutely catastrophic.
In a scenario like that, a very perverse logic of war can start to take hold. Think about it. When a government is facing a total crisis at home, we're talking soaring unemployment, economic collapse. A foreign conflict can suddenly start to look like a useful tool, a way to distract people, to unite them against a common enemy, to find a scapegoat. And this four-step spiral shows you just how fast those dominoes could have fallen. A much deeper economic shock fans the flames of extreme economic nationalism. That triggers a nasty cycle of retaliation. Both sides start canceling contracts, kicking out firms. Suddenly, breaking up the two economies isn't a policy choice, it's a reality. And in that kind of environment, a military gamble, well, it no longer seems insane. It starts to look like a viable, maybe even a rational option.
Look, in our world, thankfully, leadership and diplomacy acted like an emergency brake on all these forces. But the lesson from this is crystal clear. Economic interdependence without trust doesn't create peace. It can actually create the conditions for conflict. And that brings us to the terrifying questions this whole alternative history raises for us right now.
First, just a practical question of logistics. Both of these nations are woven into the fabric of the global economy. How do you fuel a modern war machine when the supply chains that give you everything from computer chips to engine parts have been completely shattered?
Second, the human cost. For a country like India, its young population is its greatest asset. What happens to the social and political fabric of that nation when it suffers the demographic shock of losing hundreds of thousands of people from that exact generation?
And finally, here's the question for all of us. This wouldn't be some regional conflict. It would be a global economic catastrophe on a scale that we have never, ever seen before. What would that even look like? We're going to explore the devastating answers to those very questions in Part 5.
All right, Part 5. Let's do something a little different. I want you to imagine a story with me. It's a story that, thankfully, didn't happen, but it came terrifyingly close. We're going to look at how things like ideas, feelings, and just culture can actually pave the road to war. So imagine a world teetering right on the edge. You've got these two massive powers, India and China, and they're not just having these little scuffles on the border anymore. No, they are sliding, almost inevitably, toward a massive conflict. But here's the thing, this war isn't just about soldiers and land. It's being fueled by something much deeper, a clash of the stories these nations tell about themselves, stories that have been simmering for a long, long time. So in this alternate reality, the spark that lights the whole powder keg is the death of the Dalai Lama in 2019. Instantly, you have a massive succession crisis. The Tibetan government in exile picks one kid, Beijing picks another, India, siding with the exiles, gives asylum to their choice, and to Beijing, that's not a humanitarian gesture. It's a direct attack on their national unity, a plot to split the country. So when the Galwan Valley clash happens, which, remember, actually happened in our timeline, it's not just another border incident that can be smoothed over. It's the final shove over the cliff into all-out war. So the big question is, how did we get here? What made the ground so fertile for this kind of catastrophe?
Okay, to really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down. We're going to look at the powerful currents that were pulling these two nations towards a fight. We'll dive into the huge wave of nationalism in both countries, the incredible power of social media to pour gasoline on the fire, and the stories, the deep historical stories that each nation tells itself. And then, and this is the important part, we'll look at how our reality managed to pull back from that same abyss.
Right, so at the absolute core of this whole potential conflict, you have these two incredibly powerful waves of nationalism. And what's wild is that they were rising in both India and China at the exact same time. It was like two massive tides meeting, creating the perfect storm.
And what's so fascinating is how these two ideologies are almost mirror images of each other. You look at India, and you've got Hindutva, this vision of nationalism that's all about civilizational greatness, but also, really importantly, about a feeling of being under threat. Then you look at China, and you have Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. It's all about national rejuvenation and the sacred, non-negotiable idea of territorial integrity. Now, they weren't necessarily aimed at each other, but they created this political pressure cooker at home. In that environment, compromise looks like betrayal. Backing down looks like weakness. And that is a dangerous, dangerous setup. And believe me, these ideas weren't just floating in the ether. They found incredibly fertile ground. By 2020, you're talking about more than 50 million middle-class households in India. Think about that. This is a massive group of people. They're prosperous, they're online, and they became the key audience, the main consumers for all this nationalistic media. They wanted to see an India that stood tall on the world stage, that demanded respect. And that created this huge push from within for a tougher, more assertive foreign policy.
But, you know, an ideology needs a megaphone to really catch on. And in our worlds, in the 21st century, there is no bigger, louder megaphone than social media. And this really gets to a critical question of our time, right? How does a tiny clash on a remote border, something that back in the 90s might have taken days or even weeks for news to trickle out, suddenly become a full-blown national crisis in a matter of minutes? How does that even happen? Well, it's this viral loop of digital nationalism. It works like this. Step 1, some incident happens, a skirmish on the border. Step 2, boom. Instantly, photos, videos, rumors, some real, a lot of them fake. They just explode across Weibo in China, across WhatsApp and Twitter in India. Then comes step 3. These nationalist echo chambers kick in, amplifying only the most extreme, aggressive takes. There's no room for nuance. And that leads to the final step. This tidal wave of public pressure hits the leaders. Suddenly, Modi and Xi aren't just dealing with a diplomatic incident anymore. They're trying to control their own populations who are screaming for payback online. The space for calm, rational diplomacy, it just vanishes. But see, social media is just the pipeline. The really potent stuff is what's flowing through it. The content. We're talking about the stories, the old historical wounds, the images of the enemy, and all of that, that's cooked up in the world of pop culture. That's how society gives itself social permission to go to war. And don't fool yourself, this is way more than just entertainment. Throughout the 2010s, you saw Indian movies and news shows painting China more and more as the main bad guy. At the same time, you had Chinese state documentaries and media framing India as this irrational, provocative neighbor who just needed to be put in its place. These aren't just stories, they shape the entire emotional landscape. They make aggression feel justified, even righteous, and they make compromise look like cowardice.
Take India, for example. The entire relationship with China is absolutely haunted by the ghost of the 1962 war. I mean, the story that's taught in schools, that's repeated by politicians, is one of betrayal, a stab in the back by China. This memory became like a political straitjacket. Any leader who even tried to compromise with China was immediately attacked for risking another 1962. It made diplomacy incredibly difficult. But then you flip over to China, and the memory of that exact same war is the complete opposite. It's remembered as a righteous punishment. It's framed as China teaching a necessary lesson to an aggressive India that was trying to steal its land. So just think about that. When you have two countries with totally, fundamentally irreconcilable stories about the most important event in their shared history, I mean, where do you even begin to find common ground?
And then you have the Tibet factor, which just throws another layer of complexity on top of everything. For China, it's simple. It's a core issue of national unity, period. The Dalai Lama living in India, he's seen as a threat, a separatist. But for India, it's way more complicated. It's partly a humanitarian issue. but it's also a strategic card to play against Beijing. So the status of the Dalai Lama becomes this incredibly explosive mix of religion, culture, and high-stakes geopolitics, all rolled into one.
Okay, so you look at all of this, all these combustible ingredients just sitting there, which begs the question, why didn't this war, the one from our alternate timeline, actually happen in our reality? Where did the path split? And this is maybe the most important point of this entire explainer. None of this stuff we've been talking about is hypothetical. The nationalist ideologies, the social media firestorms, the enemy images, the dueling histories, all of that is real. The gunpowder for that war was there. In fact, it's still there. The difference, it seems, came down to one word: management. In our timeline, even after the Galwan clash in 2020, when the public pressure was absolutely immense, the diplomatic lines of communication stayed open. The leaders, for all their tough talk at home, resisted the huge public demand for escalation. They kind of let the social media outrage run its course, but they crucially did not let it drive military decisions. It was that fragile, difficult management that held the line. But that brings us to a pretty sobering thought about the future, because all those social and cultural pressures, they haven't gone away. And worse, they could be supercharged by new forces that are just now coming over the horizon. And this is what we really have to think about now. What new pressures could just completely overwhelm that fragile balance in the future? For example, what happens when AI-driven propaganda makes that digital nationalism loop we talked about even faster, even more convincing? What happens when climate change starts creating fights over resources, like water, that you just can't solve with diplomacy? Or what if some new technology tempts one side into thinking they can win a quick, decisive war? The cultural currents that almost led to war are still flowing, but these new accelerants could turn them from a river into an unstoppable tsunami. And that's exactly what we're going to get into in Part 6.
Part 6. So what happens when some of the most advanced military technology in the world collides head-on with a massive, mounting environmental crisis? Well, today, we're going to dive into a scenario where that exact question pushed two of the world's biggest powers right to the brink and then over it.
Just imagine for a second, a world where the headlines on June 10th, 2020 weren't about a global pandemic, but about the start of a truly devastating war between India and China. In this explainer, we're actually going to step into that alternate timeline to understand a conflict that, thankfully, never happened in our world.
Now, this isn't just some science fiction story. We're exploring a totally plausible alternate reality, one that's grounded in real-world tech and real environmental pressures, just to see how razor-thin that line between peace and conflict really is. So the question we have to ask is, how could a simple border scuffle spin out of control into a full-blown war with missiles, cyber attacks, and even battles in space?
To answer that, you really have to look at the two key ingredients that created this high-stakes tinderbox. And the first one, the most obvious one, was the creation of the capability for a completely new kind of war.
So this first ingredient was this dramatic shift in military tech and infrastructure right there along the border. And this brings up a classic idea you hear about a lot, the security paradox. It's simple, really. The very things you do to feel safer, building new roads, deploying shiny new weapons, well, they make your adversary feel threatened. And that forces them to respond, which, in the end, actually makes you less safe. It's a vicious cycle.
And if you look at the years between 2000 and 2020, both India and China were in the middle of a massive infrastructure buildup that is a perfect example of this paradox. I mean, what was once this remote, untouched wilderness became a hyper-militarized web of bases and surveillance systems. This whole transformation made it possible to deploy troops incredibly fast, which meant that every single move was now visible and potentially a threat to the other side. And look, this new infrastructure wasn't just for moving soldiers around. It was built to support a whole new generation of weapons that totally rewrote the rules of war. We're talking about precision strike missiles that could take out key targets from hundreds of miles away. We're talking about ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, from satellites and drones, creating a battlefield where there's literally no place to hide. And we're talking about warfare jumping into brand new arenas, cyberspace to cripple an entire economy, and even into orbit itself to blind your enemy by knocking out their satellites. The really crucial takeaway here is that this new technology created this terrifying use it or lose it dynamic, where whoever strikes first has a massive advantage. But a weapon is just a tool without a reason to use it. And that brings us to our second ingredient, a slow-motion environmental crisis that provided the perfect motive for a very, very fast war.
And it all comes down to water. The Himalayan glaciers, people call them the third pole, are the water source for almost 2 billion people. That's incredible. And they're melting
fast. This isn't some problem for our grandkids. It's a problem for right now.
So as water gets more and more scarce, controlling its source suddenly becomes a matter of national survival. And that brings us to one project that looms larger than anything else: China's planned megadam on the Brahmaputra River. The number you're looking at, 60 gigawatts, is a staggering amount of power. But for India, which is downstream, it represents something totally different: an existential threat.
Now, to really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this. This proposed dam would have nearly 3 times the generating capacity of the world-famous Three Gorges Dam. Think about that. It would give China the power to control the water flow for over 200 million people downstream in India and Bangladesh. Basically, a hand on the tap.
When China has that kind of power, water isn't just a resource anymore. It's a potential reason for war. So, with both of our factors in place, the high-tech capability and the powerful motive, let's see exactly how the Galwan Valley incident of June 2020 could have spiraled completely out of control in this alternate timeline.
Okay, so this is where our reality and the alternate one just split apart. In our timeline, the clash was brutal, yes, but it was low-tech, which left room for diplomacy and de-escalation. In the alternate timeline, though, that whole use-it-or-lose-it doctrine takes over. The first move isn't with clubs and fists, it's with a missile.
And in this version of history, all that advanced tech didn't allow for a pause, no. Instead, it created this terrifyingly fast ladder of devastating responses. China launches a preemptive strike, India retaliates almost immediately, and from there, it just explodes into cyber warfare, crippling power grids and financial systems, and then space warfare, with both sides literally trying to blind each other by knocking satellites out of the sky.
And just like that, a border dispute becomes a total war over resources. Because here's the thing, unlike territory which you can divide up and negotiate over, a river's flow is a zero-sum game. It's that simple. You either control the tap or someone else does. And that brings us right back to our reality and why this war that never happened still matters so much.
You know, the scariest part of this whole alternate history is that it's not science fiction. Every single one of these ingredients for disaster exists right now, today. The missiles are deployed, the cyber weapons are active, the anti-satellite tech is real, and those environmental pressures, the melting glaciers, the water scarcity, they are getting worse every single year.
So what's the difference between the two timelines? It's not the technology. It's not the environment. The difference is us. It's the human choices that were made. In our timeline, these huge, incredible pressures were managed. They were contained through diplomacy, through restraint, and through the really hard work of building and maintaining institutions. And so far, that management has held.
So the crucial point here is that technology and the environment don't write our future in stone, but they absolutely shape the choices we have to make, and they dramatically raise the stakes. Which leaves us with a really tough question for our own timeline. The technology exists, the environmental pressures are growing. The only question is, can our diplomacy and our wisdom continue to hold the line? It's a question worth thinking about as we try to navigate our own very complex, very challenging reality.
Part 7. Let's talk about something a little chilling. We're going to dive into a war that thankfully never happened, but it was so close. A full-blown conflict between India and China that would have completely, and I mean completely, changed the world as we know it. So, I want you to do something for me. Just transport yourself back in time for a second. Picture it. You wake up, it's June 20th, 2020. And on that day, our world, our reality, was on a knife's edge, ready to split into something much darker. And look how fast it all could have gone wrong. It's just terrifying. We're talking 12 hours. In just half a day, you go from seeing a headline flash on your phone to missiles hitting cities, cyber attacks taking down power grids, the global economy just imploding. Think about that. 2 nuclear powers, with almost 40% of the world's population between them, at war. It's the definition of a nightmare scenario. Okay, so now let's come back to our reality. Right now, February 2026. Yeah, the border's tense for sure, but it's peaceful. Trade, while strained, is still happening, and diplomacy, somehow, is still alive. That catastrophe, it didn't happen. And that brings us to the big question, right? Just how thin was that thread? How close did we really come? Because make no mistake, this wasn't some sci-fi plot. This wasn't fantasy. The seeds of that potential war, they were planted in the exact same soil as our own history. So let's get into it. Let's break down the real-world pressures that made this whole thing not just possible, but honestly, pretty probable.
You know, for something like 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, the relationship between India and China was just collecting problems, piling up vulnerabilities. The best way to think about it is like a building with a cracked foundation. Bad wiring and all the fire escapes are blocked. You've got unresolved borders, huge military buildups, intense nationalism. The whole system was just a tinderbox, waiting for a match.
And every single one of those issues was a pressure point. Politically, the only reason we have the peace we have today is because a few key people in a few key moments made the right call. That's it. In that other timeline, all it would have taken was one more bad decision, one more angry speech on TV, and that whole fragile thing would have just shattered into a million pieces.
Then you've got the economy, and this is a classic double-edged sword. In our timeline, the thought of the economic fallout, how much it would cost, was a massive deterrent. It helped pull everyone back. But in the alternate timeline, that same pressure, fueled by the chaos of the COVID crisis, actually did the opposite. It pushed leaders towards the cliff, making war seem like a way to distract everyone from the problems at home. A really desperate gamble. And it wasn't just politics and economics. The cultural pressure was huge. Think about it. For decades, you had nationalist education, you had social media fanning the flames, and pretty soon you have whole populations primed and ready for a fight. In our world, the leaders somehow just barely kept a lid on it. But in that other world, imagine a spark. Something like a crisis around the Dalai Lama's death. That lid would have blown right off. It would have been impossible to stop. And this brings us to technology, and a really terrifying paradox of modern war. When you have all these super advanced, super precise weapons, it creates this dangerous mindset, a use it or lose it kind of logic. In that other timeline, the fear of getting hit first is the very thing that pushes one side to say, we have to go now, and they launch that devastating first strike. And then there's the environment. This is where you see climate change stop being some abstract future problem and become a real, direct trigger for war. Melting glaciers, arguments over who gets the water from shared rivers, these are already huge flashpoints. In that other, darker timeline, as soon as the fighting starts, guess what becomes a top military target? Dams, pipelines, water infrastructure. And suddenly, a limited border conflict turns into an all-out war for survival. So when you add it all up, all these massive pressures pushing towards war, political, economic, cultural, technological, even environmental, you realize the real question isn't how could a war have happened? The real question is, how in the world did we get so lucky? How did we manage to avoid it?
Well, our world was saved by a very specific, and I mean incredibly fragile chain of events. It's like a miracle, really. You had commanders on the ground making the choice not to open fire. You had political leaders choosing negotiation instead of mobilization. And ironically, the sheer chaos of the COVID pandemic actually helped, making the immediate cost of war just too high. But think about it. If just a couple of links in that chain had snapped, the whole thing would have come crashing down.
You know what? History is just full of stories like this. Systems that everyone thought were perfectly stable, right up until the moment they weren't. Before World War I, the common wisdom was, oh, our economies are too connected, a major war is impossible. Sound familiar? Before the 1962 war, the slogan was literally, India and China are brothers. It just goes to show you, the guardrails that are supposed to protect us, they work perfectly until they don't.
Okay, so let's fast forward to today, 2026, and let's really look at these two timelines side by side. The world we barely dodged and the one we're actually living in.
I mean, the difference is just night and day. That other 2026 is a nightmare. It's darker, it's poorer, it's way more dangerous. Diplomatic relations? Gone. Trade? Collapsed. You've got a new Cold War on your hands, and any hope of working together on something like climate change is completely dead. And the worst part, the trauma, the hatred from that war, that would last for generations. The peace we have now, as shaky and fragile as it is 1,000 times better. And that really brings us to the heart of the matter. The most important takeaway from all of this. That near miss in 2020, it was a warning shot, a huge one. Because all those underlying problems, the things that made wars so likely in the first place, they haven't magically disappeared. And that leaves us with some really big, really important questions we have to ask ourselves. First off, are things actually getting better? Are those fundamental drivers of conflict, the nationalism, the fight over water, the massive military spending, are they improving? Or are they getting worse? Is that tinderbox just getting drier and drier, just waiting for the next spark? And second, what about those guardrails we talked about? The things meant to prevent a crash? Is diplomacy getting stronger? Is there more trust between nations? Or is it all just slowly weakening, rusting away while we're not paying attention?
Because let's be real, another crisis is coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The Galwan Valley clash was managed, but just by the skin of our teeth. So what happens next time? At the next serious incident, what choice will be made?
When you boil it all down, we dodged a bullet. We avoided the worst because of some very tough choices, and let's be honest, a healthy dose of pure luck. But any system that's under that much stress for that long, eventually it's gonna break. So you have to ask, how much longer can our luck possibly hold out? Look, this story, this alternate timeline, it's a huge warning. But it's not a prophecy, it's not set in stone. It's a reminder that peace isn't just something that happens by accident. It's an achievement. It takes hard work, it takes smart leadership, and it takes the courage to step back from the edge. The future isn't written. The choice between that dark timeline and a better one, that choice is still very much ours to make.